Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into the Policing in America podcast. Today, we have on the show Bob Scales. Bob is the CEO of Police Strategies, which is basically a data analytic company that gives analytics to law enforcement officers. Bob's going to talk a little bit more about that. And Bob, could you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. As you said, my name is Bob Scales, and I'm the CEO of Police Strategies. And I'm an attorney and have served as a prosecutor and a public safety policy advisor to several mayors, and have worked under DOJ consent decrees. And for the last 8 years, we've been working with about 100 law enforcement agencies in 8 states to help them collect and analyze and report on mostly their use of force data.
Excellent. So Bob, I have been following you on some social media, and I'm always fascinated by many of your posts, and I read them. I share this information with others, and we probably have mutual contacts. One is Dr. David Blake,
hmm
who I used extensively in some of my dissertation work, and so he will oftentimes forward things that you write. So my big curiosity is the consent decrees. And this seems to be an area of expertise. Am I overstepping that with you, or is that about, would you
Well,
consider
I have
yourself?
I have I have firsthand experience working with DOJ on pattern or practice investigations and under a consent decree. And I've also researched all the other current and past consent decrees. So if that makes me an expert, yeah, I'm an expert, but I have firsthand experience with the process.
Okay, fair enough. And it would seem like many of the things that come out are not in favor of this overarching sort of overbearing process where if I'm for the audience members, would you maybe describe or define what a consent decree is and how a law enforcement agency might find itself under this?
Sure. So back in 1994, Congress passed a big crime bill, and part of that crime bill was statute 41 USC 42 USC 14141, and that gave the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division the authority to conduct pattern or practice investigations of local and state law enforcement agencies for unconstitutional policing. And so the Justice Department already has the authority to investigate, and prosecute individual police officers for civil rights violations. So that authority already existed. But this statute gave the department the ability to investigate the entire department, but only for a pattern or practice. Now, there is no definition of what a pattern or practice is. So a pattern or practice is whatever DOJ says it is. So the idea is that DOJ will come in and they will ask for a few years of records from the department, hundreds of thousands of records, policies, training materials, incident reports. And then DOJ will take anywhere between 8 months to 2 years to conduct their investigation. All of this is done in secret. DOJ will not ever reveal how they investigate or how they came up with their conclusions. But at the conclusion of their investigation, they will issue a findings report. And in that report, it will say that the DOJ has reasonable cause to believe that the department has a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing. And it could be uses of force, it could be biased policing, it could be stops, it could be searches, it could be sort of any aspect of law enforcement. And they will, in their reports, as the most recent report they did was in Louisville, and which was 70 or 80 pages, and they will just destroy the department, and they will say it's the worst department in the country, the systematic abuses of authority, people's constitutional rights are routinely violated, and the only solution is to enter into a court enforceable consent decree with DOJ. And so then the city has a choice. They can either walk away or they can sign the agreement. And to this day, after more than 25 years of this statute being in place, there is only one jurisdiction that's ever walked away from a DOJ pattern or practice finding, and that was the Alamance County Sheriff in North Carolina. And the DOJ said, you have a pattern or practice of bias policing, and you have to do a consent decree. And the sheriff said no. And sheriffs can do that because they're separately elected. And so they have the authority to make their own decisions. So the sheriff refused to sign the consent decree. The DOJ then sued the sheriff's office in court and civilly. And in order to force the sheriff's office into a consent decree, they had to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the sheriff's office did in fact have a pattern or practice of bias policing. They failed. DOJ failed. And the U.S. District Judge wrote a 250-page scathing indictment of the DOJ investigation and basically said, you have no evidence. You presented no evidence to show a pattern or practice. And so then the DOJ appealed, and as it was on appeal, they said to the sheriff, hey, we'll drop our appeal if you sign this letter promising that you'll do these things. And the sheriff said, sure, I'll sign a letter saying I'll do these things. And so they dropped the appeal. Every single city, and of course, cities are run by mayors and city councils, not by the police chiefs. And so in a city, it's the mayor that signs the consent decree, not the police chief. And so mayors obviously are elected officials, and they are highly influenced by the political pressures that DOJ puts upon them. So there is no mayor that's ever refused DOJ's request for a consent decree. And so when the mayor signs the consent decree, that places the department, the police department, under the jurisdiction of the federal court. And every consent decree requires the city to hire a private for-profit monitor who will determine whether or not the city is in compliance with the consent decree. And so these monitors have a inbuilt conflict of interest. And usually a monitor's contract is at least $1 million a year for writing a few reports. And so the monitor will always find something wrong. And so consequently, these consent decrees are now lasting more than a decade. And there's no way to get out of them because the monitor will always find something wrong. And they'll tell the judge, well, they're in compliance with these 9 things, but these 2 things, they're out of compliance. And so the consent decree will continue, and the monitor will continue to take their paycheck. And meanwhile, the department in Seattle, for example, Seattle's been under a consent decree for just over a decade. They have spent $200 million trying to comply with the consent decree. And they're still not in full compliance. They're going to get out of some of it, but and that is the case for every major department under a consent decree. You spend hundreds of millions of dollars trying to essentially fix a phony problem, because in the DOJ findings letters, they will never provide the evidence to support their claims. In Seattle, the DOJ issued a findings letter in 2011, and they said 20% of Seattle PD's use of force are unconstitutional. And we told the DOJ that's not possible. We review every single case. There's no way that 20% of our use of force incidents are unconstitutional. Show us the cases. The DOJ refused. They said, no, we won't show you any of the cases that we found would be unconstitutional. And then we said, well, show us your methodology. How did you come up with this calculation and this number? They refused. They said, you have to trust us. We know what we're doing, and sign here on the consent decree if you want us to go away. And so eventually the mayor did sign. So that I can go on, but I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate that. So it's Bob, that's incredible. It's good information. So the federal government, because of this, what was that you said, what was passed in the crime bill?
Yeah, so it's 1994, 42 USC 14141. And that gives the DOJ the authority to conduct a pattern of practice investigation. What's interesting about that statute is that there was a second section, 14142. And that section said that the Department of Justice has to collect national data on excessive force cases and publish annual reports with that data. DOJ has never done that. So they are out of compliance with the statute that authorizes them to conduct pattern or practice investigations. And one thing DOJ never does, they never use data, which is why they don't release their findings, that back up their findings. So they don't collect, they don't know how to analyze police use of force cases, and so they don't. They just make it up. They make up these anecdotal stories. And so they've never complied with the federal statute that requires them to collect this data.
Interesting. Bob, are you of the opinion that this, I want to word the question and I want to be sort of fair. Are there good actors within this process who are truly, I don't know, altruistic, ambitious, and want to make changes? And is this process just sort of a bureaucratic nightmare? Or do you think from top to bottom, this is a corrupt mechanism?
Well, it is a political mechanism. It's not a reform, it's political. And so I am convinced that everyone in the DOJ Civil Rights Division truly believes that they are doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that they have all the answers. They believe that there is systemic and widespread abuse of authority in police departments in the country. They truly believe that, and they believe that they have all the answers, and that consent decrees will do that. The problem is that there's no evidence to support their beliefs, and there is no consent decree ever that has successfully reformed a department, despite more than 75 consent decrees being imposed over the last 25 years. Not a single one of them has successfully eliminated or reduced a pattern or practice because the pattern or practice never existed in the first place. So DOJ, in order to promote their political beliefs, they will make up these findings letters and fabricate their conclusions based on no evidence. Because in their hearts, they believe that there's something wrong. They just can't prove it. And they don't have to prove it because they don't have to go to court. All they have to do is convince the mayor to sign the consent decree, which is simply a contract. So they do not have the ability to prove their case in court, which is why they try to avoid having to go to court.
Okay. So we can let's go, we'll make some assumptions and tell me if I'm off on this. We can make an assumption that most, if not all, police departments could do things to improve.
Yes.
That's a fair statement.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And
there is misconduct, right? There is, every year there are officers, who are disciplined, who are dismissed and terminated, who are prosecuted for criminal violations. So there is no question that there are problems within law enforcement in the United States. And the issue is not, are there problems? The issue is, how widespread are those problems? And the issue is, when problems occur, do agencies hold the officers accountable? And because you're never going to get perfection. You're never going to get all the officers, all 800 officers in the country, to never make a mistake. And right. So if the problem is relatively limited, which all evidence shows that it is, and if when a problem occurs, the agency holds the officers accountable, then that's the best you can hope to do. And that is what's happening in almost all law enforcement agencies. Now there are problems usually these are smaller agencies that don't have much oversight and have very inexperienced leadership and officers. The DOJ doesn't care about them because they're too small. They're too small to worry about. They want the Minneapolis, the Phoenix, the Louisville, the Seattle, the New Orleans, the Baltimore. Those are the ones that get the headlines. Those are the ones that get all the acclaim, and these smaller departments there's just no question that there are some really bad departments out there, and that actually do need federal intervention because they cannot fix themselves. But those are the departments that DOJ doesn't care about.
So, okay, thank you for that. Now, the one I think of often is this one in Ferguson, and this was the flashpoint for hands up, don't shoot. And the first time I had ever really heard of, I think because it was such national attention, the DOJ, right? The Federal Department of Justice descended into Ferguson. What seemed like with every intention and incentive to find wrongdoing with the officer. And as I understand it, the incident that happened was found to be within the standards of the law.
Correct.
And there was no hands up, don't shoot. That this was not a quip that just took hold, a hashtag, but never really was in any reality of a student or a citizen kneeling down, putting their hands up, right? So that was found. However, then I'm told there was a pattern and practice. And what it sounded like was there was an over policing of a inner city community to make money out of tickets.
Yep.
So that's just what I know from far away. Are you familiar with that and
Yeah,
could speak to that? Okay,
yeah,
please.
that's my understanding as well. And again, all I
Okay.
know are what's been reported publicly. But that is typically what happens, is that the DOJ will react to a high profile incident, and they
Mm-hmm.
will launch an investigation, a pattern or practice investigation based on a single incident. And
Mm-hmm.
that's obviously, what happened, for example, in Louisville. One bad shooting got a lot of attention, and the same thing in Ferguson with Michael Brown. And so the the DOJ goes in based on a single incident, but they're looking for a pattern or practice. So they're looking at everything in the department. They're not just looking at that incident. And what's
Mm-hmm.
interesting about the officer that shot Michael Brown was that he was investigated by the district attorney and found no criminal activity. He was also investigated by the U.S. Department of Justice, and he was not charged with any civil rights violation because there was no evidence to support a criminal charge against him. But the DOJ, when they did their pattern or practice investigation, they said, "Wait a minute, you're basically doing all these traffic stops in Ferguson to raise money for the city.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no law enforcement purpose, and you're out there just ticketing people routinely, and they're usually Ferguson residents who are poor and unable to pay. And then you have all these additional fines and charges and everything. So they did find abusive practices within the department, but they had nothing to do with the reason for their initial investigation. Now, the question is whether what the problems that they found were a pattern or practice of unconstitutional policing, and that's questionable. I mean, you can have problems in a department that are not violations of the U.S. Constitution, which is the only thing that the DOJ has jurisdiction over. So
Mm-hmm.
so Ferguson's a hard example, but it is an example of a smaller department that has some serious problems, but
Mm-hmm.
not the problems that DOJ has jurisdiction over.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay. Because there may be a problem with how they're policing, but that would be a local, like even though they're giving tickets to these community members, that isn't necessarily violating people's rights. They're not issuing false tickets. Am I
Right.
understanding that right?
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't know all the specifics, but
Okay.
I do know that they were not. Uh, I mean, I think DOJ did find a pattern or practice of excessive or unnecessary force, but generally
Mm-hmm.
there's no evidence to support those findings. Um, but the other thing to bear in mind is when you enter into a consent decree, it may be because of a specific finding of a specific problem.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens in these consent decrees is that they grow, and there's scope creep, and the goalposts keep moving. And that's what's
Mm-hmm.
happening in places like Baltimore and New Orleans and Cleveland, where they're basically in compliance with the reason the consent decree was put into place, but then the monitor and the judge find all these other problems that they'd like to throw into the consent decree. So that's why they're
Mm-hmm.
never ending, because you always find some problem that you can potentially solve, even though it has nothing to do with a pattern or practice.
So, question for you, two that come to mind, because if you're really caring about pattern and practice of a particular agency, it would seem to me, and I've yet to see a consent decree that has said can they mandate you do something in the consent decree? Like when you're under it, if they say you shall do this, are they only recommendations?
Well, here's the problem is that the federal government cannot force local law enforcement agencies to do anything. They
Hmm.
have no legal authority to require departments to do anything. Everything is contractual.
Wow.
So they have the authority to investigate. That's all they have the authority to do under the federal statutes. They have the authority to investigate. It is the courts that have to make a determination if there's an actual pattern or practice. And if the court finds there's a pattern or practice, then it's the court to determine what the remedy for that is. But what happens is that DOJ comes in, they say, you have a pattern or practice. In order to
Hmm.
fix that, you have to sign this agreement. If you don't sign the agreement, then we'll sue you in court. But if
Hmm.
they sue them in court, the worst thing that can happen is that you would get a consent decree. So there's no incentive whatsoever for a city to sign a consent decree because you're essentially pleading guilty to
Hmm.
something where there's no evidence. No evidence has been presented that you've done anything wrong. It's simply accusations made by the DOJ, and yet you're pleading guilty and you're agreeing to a 10-year sentence for $200 million. Um, and why would anybody do that? But they do because of the political pressure brought by DOJ on local officials. Um, so the thing that most people don't understand is that the federal government has no authority here. The only authority comes from this contractual agreement. And
Hmm.
then once the contract is signed, then the judge technically becomes a party to that agreement because the judge will decide if you're in compliance. And the monitor works for the judge and reports to the judge, even though they're paid for by the city. And the monitor has a financial incentive to find an agency out of compliance, which they do routinely. And so you have this, once you've signed a consent decree, it's all over. You're done. You might as well just check out. You're no longer in charge of your department. The federal judge and the monitor will determine what your city budget looks like. If you want to spend money on social services and the monitor wants you to spend more money on police training, forget it. You have to do the police training. And so all these cities now are having buyer's remorse for signing these consent decrees.
Hmm.
And it's there's no way out. There's no way out because the judge controls them. And so it's interesting what's happening in New Orleans now because the judge has ordered these public hearings. They're not even court hearings. They're public hearings on the consent decree with the monitor, and they order the mayor and the police chief and all the command staff to attend these meetings.
Hmm.
And they're just publicity stunts. They have no purpose. And so the mayor said, no, I'm not going to attend these meetings anymore because I've got work to do and my staff has work to do and we can't spend time preparing and attending these meetings when the city is in turmoil and we have a shortage of police officers, et cetera. And the judge has been, now there's in this standoff, and the judge is saying, you have to attend my meetings. And the mayor's saying, no, I won't. But the judge has no authority. There's no subpoena here. The judge just
Ah.
wants the mayor to sit there and the police chief to sit there to listen to her. And so you get into this incredibly petty political, power plays between the judge and the city and the police department and DOJ and the monitor. And there's no way out once you sign that agreement. And so when Louisville, the mayor has said, I'm going to sign a consent decree with DOJ, even before he saw the findings letter. And that consent decree is going to outlast that mayor and many other mayors and many police
Hmm.
chiefs. And so he's basically giving the city budget and the police department over to the federal government and the federal judge and checking out.
So, man, okay. So the one thing I would think of, this is a lot. The one thing I would think of is twofold. If a consent decree wants to better a police agency, excuse me, I've yet to hear about one that said we recommend or mandate that every officer has a college degree or some sort of higher education or some sort of minimum requirement on age when the psychologists in the medical field know that somebody who's 21, 22, 23 is still developing their brain. Their brain is still growing and learning and not necessarily having the processing power to solve complicated problems, as maybe say a 28, 29-year-old where our brain's fully developed and can process these stimuli and these inputs better. It seems like that would be one. Two, I've yet to see anyone talk about a passion of mine, which is sleep and sleep deprivation. So there are plenty of federal oversights in the rail car, trucking, shipping, airline industry, even military and medicine, where they say, look, we know that sleep deprivation is a problem. And it seems like I can't even get a seat at the table in law enforcement to say, when officers routinely are operating on 5 or less hours of sleep, we shouldn't be surprised that there's bad outcomes. And I've never seen them say anything about scheduling or double shifts or any of that. Have you heard about any of those recommendations?
Here's the big problem. So policing is unlike any other profession, because other professions like, medicine or, air traffic or, education, any other profession, they use data, they use science, they use research, they use evidence to develop training and policies and practices. That does not happen in law enforcement. There is no use of force data to show what is a good training program, what is a good de-escalation training program. How do we work on what are best practices for officers, well-being and mental health and so forth. There's nothing. There are no best practices because there is no evidence. And so what happens is that DOJ comes in and says, we have all the answers. And you say, well, what are the answers? No, we have to work them out. Every agency is different. We're going to do it all from scratch. And so one of the things that DOJ should be doing is saying, okay, we're going to fund a lot of research and we're going to collect a lot of data and we're going to see what works and what doesn't work. So we're going to come up with the best use of force policy, the best de-escalation training, the best accountability system, and we're going to put it out there for all the agencies. And then if we find an agency with a problem, then we'll say, look, you adopt these best practices, and then we'll evaluate you again. And if you still haven't approved, then maybe we'll have to do some kind of federal oversight. But there's no what DOJ needs to do is provide the resources and the expertise to help agencies improve. You can't force them. You can't beat them into submission and say, okay, now you're going to be better. Stop using excessive force, and beat them down to say that you can't use excessive force. So we need a collaborative model. And then if the agency refuses, if the agency is like, screw you, we're going to continue doing whatever we want to do, then go after them with a consent decree. But in Seattle, for example, we said, look, when DOJ issued their findings, Seattle said, we will implement anything you want. We'll do any training you want. We'll have any IT system you want. We'll spend as much money as you want us to spend, but we don't want to pay $1 million a year for a monitor, and we don't want to have a federal judge that we have to report to, but we will report to you, and we'll do an MOU, we'll do an agreement, but we don't want to do a consent decree. DOJ said no. DOJ said the reforms will only work if we force you to do them. And the term that DOJ uses is hard baked. They said we have to hard bake the reforms into the department or they won't last. And the problem is that the hard baking doesn't work. They end up burning the department to the ground. And so that's the problem. We need data, and that's sort of where we come in with our company, is like, we need data, we need science, we need academics, we need good solid research to really understand what is happening so we can identify the specific problems and then develop solutions to deal with them. The one size fits all consent decrees make things worse.
So this is an interesting point with the data. And I often think too, data should drive the conclusions. And I think it seems like the steam has run out on the implicit bias training. It seems like for a while that was big. Yes. And I forget, I think it was like Josh Carell did that huge study in NYPD. And they actually looked at data and they trained, 30,000 people. Stop me if you already know the answer, the punchline. And the pre and post data was, when I say statistically similar, it was almost statistically identical. So even though the training was well received, even though officers spoke very highly about the training, Prior to the training, 33% of all stops were people of this color. After the training, 33% of the stops.
Yep.
30, right? Like there was no difference. And this wasn't like a bunch of officers who said this was BS.
Yeah.
They liked it.
Yeah.
They reported learning about it. They said this was interesting. Okay, right. So from a data perspective, we would say, okay, useful, but don't think this is going to have any profound changes.
That's the biggest problem is that, I mean, millions of dollars have been spent on implicit bias training. The goal of implicit bias training for everyone is to reduce racial disparities. It's not to provide enjoyable training for officers or teach them something they didn't already know. The goal is we have these huge racial disparities. We think these racial disparities are due to officer bias. If we do implicit bias training, those disparities should go down. It never happens. And most of these evaluations of implicit bias training are from officers. Did you like the training? Yeah. Do you think you learned something? Yeah. Well, that's great. Let's do more of it. But it has absolutely no impact on the results that you want. And so that's the same across the board. De-escalation training, right? It's a great skill to have. I've been through the 40-hour crisis intervention training class. It's wonderful. I think it's great. It has absolutely no impact on an officer's use of force numbers because use of force is not driven by officer behavior, it's driven by suspect behavior. If an officer flees or threatens the officer, assaults the officer, threatens or assaults someone else, then the officer is going to have to use some level of force in order to stop that and bring the person into custody. So yes, there may be a few incidents where because of my de-escalation training, I was able to convince the suspect not to flee. But that's pretty rare. And statistically, there's been no study that's really shown a statistically significant difference in before and after training. And studies that have been done don't take into account the reduction in arrests and so forth. There's so many factors that go into a use of force incident that you cannot say that the de-escalation training actually worked in this incident.
Yeah. And I think that's I forget what the proper term is, like the univariant fallacy. This idea that there's one variable.
Yep, exactly.
And if we change this variable, we're going to see this domino effect, right?
Yep.
And this is a multiple variable, multifaceted problem, and we shouldn't expect. Okay, Bob, let me. I'm going to hold this point. We shouldn't expect perfection, and I debate with people on this, and they'll say, "Well, perfection is the goal, but it shouldn't be the expectation, because human error is going to happen." You're going to have this. And if you have a bad actor, and you could, like, what happened with Tyree Nichols, these are bad actors.
Yep.
Right. So we need to purge that.
Yep.
They need to be removed out and taken out. But I don't think they must have gone through de-escalation training. They must have, at this point. They're young officers.
Some of them did. Some of them were CIT certified. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Right. So go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, you hit it right on the head, which is people have such a simplistic view of law enforcement. And you think if we do this, then it will change that. And so yeah, all we can really hope to do is get rid of the really bad actors and the ones that should never be police officers. And then when officers do screw up, right, hold them accountable for their screw ups. But there's no one size fits all. And so if you get into an encounter with an individual and they're resisting arrest, the officer has limitless possibilities on what they could do. There is no one right answer in every single situation. And so for example, a subject refuses to comply to a lawful order and refuses to put their hands behind their back. Okay, what should the officer do? Well, should they use their taser? Should they grab them by the arm? Should they take them down to the ground? Should they continue to request that they put their hands behind their back for another 10 minutes? I mean, there are a whole host of things that the officer could do. And there are policies and training to take into consideration, and every department is different. There's just no one size fits all. And that's the problem is that we think that if we just, prevent officers, like right now in Washington State, we have so many restrictive laws on what officers can do that you've basically taken away all their options, right? Officers cannot use neck restraints anymore. They cannot pursue vehicles in most situations. They can't use it for a while. They couldn't use force without probable cause. I mean, there's so many restrictions. So basically you're left with a shoot, don't shoot scenario. Because you've taken away all of their other less lethal options, and you don't want them to do anything. And so that leads to fewer arrests being made and more suspects getting away and fleeing officers and so forth. So there's the big problem is that most of the policymakers have no understanding of law enforcement, and there's no data to back up any of their decisions, and so it leads to terrible unintended consequences.
And Bob, tell me if I'm on point with this, or the data they do have is an incomplete picture.
Or it's completely false. I mean, the big problem, I get into disputes all the time with anti-police activists that use data to essentially present a false narrative of what's happening. And most legislators now are very receptive. Since the George Floyd protests, legislators want to be seen as doing something to police, right? We need to stop police from hurting people. We need to regulate them more. And so they're very receptive to the anti-police data, and they're very reluctant to look at actual facts that don't support the narrative.
Yeah. And just in some conversations with Dr. Blake, he says that an issue he'd like to hear us talk about is this population-based statistical analysis.
Yep.
Do you write about this?
All the time.
Would you mind talking a little bit about population-based statistical analysis, please?
Sure. So there's very little data on policing, but what little data is available is always compared to the population as a benchmark. So for example, and census population is readily available. So people will say, okay, 10% of the population is Black, and 20% of the stops are Black drivers. So Blacks are twice as likely to be stopped as we would expect based on their population, and maybe 3 times more likely as white drivers to be stopped. And that is evidence of racial profiling and police bias. That's the typical narrative that we see over and over and over again, not only by activists, but in the media. And when we write racial disparity report or demographic disparity reports for departments, we usually have a 100-page appendix on our methodology and why population is not a valid benchmark. And also the other thing that people fail to understand or recognize is that racial disparities with the population exist throughout society. It's not just in law enforcement data. So if you look at poverty, if you look at homelessness, if you look at unemployment, if you look at income and education and healthcare, housing, racial disparities all over the place. This is not unique to law enforcement, but people think that the racial disparities in law enforcement are 100% due to police bias. When in fact, yes, those racial disparities exist with the population, but the racial disparities are a function of all the other racial disparities in society that give certain groups a disadvantage and makes them more prone to engage in criminal behavior. And people also don't look at disparities by gender. We have huge disparities by gender. Males are much more likely to be arrested than females. Now, is that because police are biased against males? Obviously not. Males are more likely to engage in criminal behavior, particularly violent criminal behavior. We have disparities by age. If you're 18 to 24, you're much more likely to engage in criminal behavior than a juvenile or a senior citizen. Now, is that a function of police bias? Police are biased against 20-year-olds? No. I mean, it's they're responding to community concerns. And what we do is, instead of looking at the population as a benchmark, which treats everybody equally, if you use
Hmm.
population as a benchmark, you have to assume that juveniles and senior citizens are committing crimes at the same rate as 20-year-olds, and
Mm.
that males and females commit crimes at the same rate, and that only residents of your city only commit crimes within your city limits. I mean,
Mm.
none of those things are true, but they have to be true to use population as a benchmark. So when we do these types of studies, we look at data on reported crimes and reported crime victims. And because that is information that doesn't have anything to do with the police, but it impacts how the police respond. So if
Hmm.
your community is reporting that, even if your population is 10% black, if your community is reporting that 20% of the crime suspects are black, then we would expect the police to arrest 20% of all their arrests to be black arrestees. And that's what we find in the data, is when you control for reported crime suspects, the disparities for age, race, and gender go away. And that's what we would expect, because we would expect the police to be responding to 911 calls and community concerns and arresting the people that the community says are committing crimes. And so the disparities are driven by the community reporting crimes and not the police uh, 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 being biased against particular groups.
So, Bob, is it fair to say, because of the historical reality, that there was a time when policing was overtly not administering justice fair and was overtly targeting certain groups? I mean, if you go back, 30, 40 years, do you think that echoes into today's society? So because of that history,
Yeah.
it's hard to shake that?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One is that there's no question that historically policing has been racist and biased. No question. Um, and there's also no question that our society, historically, with slavery and treatment of Native Americans, et cetera, has been systemically racist and biased. And
Mm-hmm.
and those impacts we see today in disparities in our economy and in our society.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge is, and I agree that we should do everything we can to address racial disparities in our society.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is, what is the underlying cause of those disparities? Is it that the police are racist and they are out there routinely stopping, arresting, using force against Black people and Native Americans because of the color of their skin? Or is it because our society is so unfair and unjust that there are certain groups that are more likely to commit criminal behavior because they are disadvantaged and they don't
Mm.
have homes and jobs, and they may have drug addictions and alcohol addictions? I mean, that is the root cause of the racial disparities in the criminal justice system, or other injustices in our society, not the systemic bias of police officers. Now, the caveat to that is that I know that there are, and there will be, biased and racist officers in the United States. And we
Mm-hmm.
have seen, evidence of that in certain incidents. The issue is not, does bias exist or not exist? The issue is, how widespread is it? And so what
Mm-hmm.
we need to do is focus on those incidents where we can prove bias and civil rights violation and deal with those issues, and not blame the entire profession
Mm-hmm.
for historical abuses of power or the abuses of a few individuals, and focus instead on the systemic causes of racial disparities in the criminal justice system, which will, I mean, if you are in a city with impoverished areas and housing projects and a lot of unemployment and homelessness, and you provide services and you provide housing and you provide jobs for those individuals, your crime rates are going to go down. And if there's disparities in those areas, your racial disparities in the criminal justice system are going to go down. Not
Hmm.
because the police did anything differently, but because you're providing resources and opportunities to those people who are most vulnerable and likely to engage in criminal behavior. That's where we need to focus our attention.
So then, okay, this begs the question, then is there merit, and I'm going to use the phrase, but then we're going to clean it up. Is there merit to this idea of defund the police? Now, the people who are truly thoughtful, they don't mean just take money away and get rid of police. I think what they were trying to say was we need to reallocate resources. So let's not use the term defund moving forward. It's should we reallocate these resources and maybe make policing, they take a lion's share of a city's budget to the tune of $1 billion or more. Is that a reasonable framework for people who want to make a difference? And how do you see that space?
Yeah, so absolutely. If we did not need the police, if we did
Hmm.
not have criminal behavior in our society, then absolutely there's no reason to fund the police, right?
Hmm.
So we don't, but that's not the case. I mean, we have
Uh,
a very violent society, and we have a lot of criminal behavior, not only violent crime, but property crime. And until that goes away, we are going to need policing services. And right now, we don't have an overfunding of police departments. We have an underfunding of police departments because of massive staffing shortages. And
right.
so the police cannot, they don't have enough officers to provide even basic public safety services. And
Hmm.
so to talk about then cutting, and they can't pay officers enough to recruit new officers to come and be officers. So we
Right.
have literally we have an opposite problem here where we need more funding for law enforcement because the communities are public safety is going in the wrong direction. So we literally have to do both. I mean, you have to focus and you have to target your funding on these most vulnerable communities where crime is rampant, and provide them
Hmm.
with the services to reduce the criminal. And once you start reducing criminal behavior, then you can start talking about reducing your policing. Absolutely.
Hmm.
But we can't take the police. You can't just say, oh yeah, if we move money from the police to these, then everything will be good. It doesn't. It just doesn't work that way. And there's no jurisdiction that's ever done that, successfully.
Yeah. In fact, many of them are reversing course
Yep.
because, again, that was the thought. We're just going to take hundreds of millions of dollars and put it here. But even to allocate that money and then to put a hammer to a nail or to do anything that's going to build houses, like this is years, if not decades, of an investment from a city perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's not going to, it's certainly, I mean, in Seattle, I always joke, 20 years ago, Seattle initiated a 10-year plan to end homelessness.
Hmm.
Um, and homelessness is rampant now, like we've never seen before in Seattle, despite hundreds of millions of dollars, spent. And that
Yeah.
homeless crisis creates a lot of public safety problems that the police have to deal with. So
Yeah.
you have to implement effective solutions to other societal problems before you can expect the police to reduce their numbers and not have a crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. Agree. And I think if I, in my own opinion, humbly, seeing this now for 2 decades, we're framing the problems improperly.
Yep.
We're trying to make it sound like it's so simple that if we just wave a magic wand, and I offer this scenario, if this observable universe is a for the sake of the explanation, it's a simulation, and the coder takes out the program for racism, and that's it. Like now, our society no longer has racism. I think we're still going to have a number of problems in policing because I don't think that is going to be the magic bullet. There's still issues with who we hire, how we're training, how we're retraining. It seems like you have a very high standard to get into a department, but then there's almost no standard to continue to progress through the department.
Yeah, I mean, I get so frustrated with sort of blanket accusations against the law enforcement profession with no evidence, and like Louisville's like a perfect example. So
Hmm.
2 or 3 weeks ago, the DOJ issued its findings letter, and the mayor did a joint press conference with the attorney general, and basically they said Louisville is one of the worst departments in the country. They're racist, they're biased, they engage in excessive force, on and on and on. It was an awful report.
Yeah.
And then this week, the Louisville police officers, charged into a bank with a shooter who'd killed 4 people. One officer was shot, and they ended
Yeah.
up, shooting and killing the assailant. But now the mayor is standing with the police saying, and they were at the press conference, they were saying how brave and heroic and their
Right.
officers are, which is all true. But just 2 weeks prior, the mayor was saying they were terrible. And and
Yeah.
and there's certainly a lot of evidence of their heroism in the recent incident, but DOJ provided no evidence, or the evidence that they provided, a lot of things in their report about Louisville. The department had already disciplined and prosecuted officers. So they
Oh,
had already held the officers accountable for a lot of the problems that DOJ said that Louisville had. So they're it's like you can't win, right? If you take care of the
yeah.
problem, and you had a problem that you took care of, DOJ will still say you've got a problem. And
Yeah.
so that's the real challenge, is that the law enforcement across the country has just been vilified for individual incidents. Like I mean, in Washington State, we had a whole slew of police reform legislations that were based on what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd. Had
Right.
no bearing on any law enforcement agency or any officer in Washington State. And yet the legislature, for example, banned neck restraints because of
Yeah.
what happened to George Floyd. There was absolutely no evidence that this law will save any lives. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that not allowing neck restraints, which are a very safe and effective technique if used properly,
Hmm.
um, and the legislature took that away, which means that officers no longer can use neck restraints, and they will have to use either tasers or their firearms. And
Right.
so, and also, what happened to George Floyd was not a lateral neck restraint. It was
Right.
already an unauthorized technique, putting a knee on someone's neck. No agency authorizes that, and yet
Right.
we're prohibiting valid, lawful, safe techniques because of
Yeah.
something that happened across the country. And many states have done this, and many departments have done this, and it's going to have detrimental impacts. And so I really feel for officers and law enforcement agencies now, because you're just in a no-win situation, and everything that's being done to law enforcement is just making it harder for them to do their jobs and making the situation worse. And I don't see any anything on the horizon that is gonna make things better.
Yeah. I tend to agree with everything you said. There are tens of thousands of jujitsu gyms across America,
Hmm.
and I would say on average, at least 100, if most likely more, young adolescents and teenagers and young men and women are being put out, because they're trying to fight through, and they go out and then they wake up and they continue to roll. And it is a very safe and humane technique. It has a very bad sounding name,
Yeah,
a bilateral, neck restraint, anything like that,
yeah,
upper body carotid control hold, something that
yep, yep,
makes it sound a little better. But yeah, any kind of choke hold. And there's a difference between an air choke and a blood
sure.
choke.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
So but nobody wants to get into that.
No,
Here
no,
they did it in
no.
California.
Yeah.
And
Well,
you just wonder, in these situations, now officers will, like, some officers will tell me, so technically I could take my pencil and stab somebody in the eye, and I won't get prosecuted if it's a deadly force situation. But if I try to do this,
that's right.
I could get prosecuted.
Well, and if you ask, I mean, and so many officers have told me this, is if because obviously officers, when they go through training, right? They have to be pepper sprayed and they have to be
Sure.
tased. And if they allow neck restraints, then they'll have to have a neck restraint used against them and render them unconscious. And if you give an officer a choice between being rendered unconscious with a neck restraint, being pepper sprayed, or being tased, they will always pick the neck
Yes.
restraint.
100%.
So the officers know themselves from their own experience that this is a very safe technique with very low injury, very low pain, and everything
Yes.
else. And yet that's the technique that is banned, and these other more dangerous techniques and more painful techniques are allowed.
Yes. Well, okay. So I want to be aware of your time, and I could go on and on with this, but let me ask you this. What is, if the consent decree is not a viable option, what do you say is a viable option to help these agencies improve?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because the chief U.S. data scientist in the White House issued a request for information last month,
Hmm.
and they basically asked anyone to provide advice on how they could improve their data collection and analysis and reporting on law enforcement. And the federal government should, and it hasn't, but it should collect, analyze, and report on specifically use of force data. Now, the FBI has a deadly force data collection program, but they refuse to release the data,
Hmm.
which is crazy because it's the data is for the public, and yet the FBI refuses to release it. So they need to release that data. They need to collect more use of force data, analyze it with qualified experts, and report on that data. They need to use that data, work with academics and work with law enforcement professionals to develop evidence-based best practices for use of force policies, for use of force training, for accountability systems. And they need to provide that to all the agencies, and they need to provide funding and technical assistance to help law enforcement agencies improve. And if they did that, they could help thousands of agencies and work collaboratively with law enforcement instead of these onerous consent decrees that are it's an adversarial process. It's extremely expensive. It's extremely time consuming with zero results. And so stop doing that and start working collaboratively. You can work with a lot more agencies and get a lot more impact, and actually have it be data driven and evidence based.
That is a positive message to end on. Bob, I'm going to have you on again, if you will, and I'm going to
Sure.
dig a little bit deeper. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about some of your writings, but I wanted to introduce you to the audience and just sort of get you out there with the people that listen, and then
Yeah,
get their feedback. And then let's get you on again and dive a little deeper into the specifics.
that would be great. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on, and we'll be in touch.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye bye.